Hi, my name is Bronwen Powell, and I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there in person, given that I have very fond memories of my internship at the World Vegetable Center in Arusha back in 2008 and 2009. I'm also very sorry that my personal circumstances prevent me from making this a video presentation. I want to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to this research, including a team of students, graduate and undergraduate students from Penn State University, my colleague Kate Kirby at the University of Toronto and Max Planck Institute, and my dear mentor, Dr. Patrick Maundu, who is one of East Africa's best known ethnobiologists. As I'm sure you've already heard at this meeting, vegetables are absolutely essential for human nutrition and diet quality. The World Health Organization lists low fruit and vegetable consumption as one of the top 10 modifiable risk factors for mortality globally. The World Health Organization and the FAO have set international recommendations of 200 grams per day of vegetables per person. Yet, most people in the world do not meet these recommended levels of consumption, and this is true even in East Africa, where vegetables are such a central part of the diet. Traditional vegetables and underutilized vegetables have such an important role in diet in East Africa, and yet for generations, for many, many years, they've been devalued, in part because of something that I call nutritional colonialism. These traditional foods were seen as uncivilized during colonial times, and local dietary practices were also often seen and called as harmful, often without much evidence. Still today, some health experts fear some of the phytochemicals or toxins in traditional vegetables, and even some African nutritionists and nutrition extension agents continue to perpetuate some of these ideas. My talk today will be focused on preferences for traditional vegetables, and so I need to start by talking about where food preferences come from. Food preferences are bound by many social and cultural factors. Food is a central part of individual, social, and cultural identity. Claude Fisher, a famous French sociologist, said, "If food makes the eater, it is natural for the eater to try and make himself through what he eats." Food aversions are largely innate, but food preferences are strongly shaped by culture. They are learnt. A preference for bitter taste is particularly interesting because bitter taste should mark the presence of harmful chemicals or toxins in a plant. And yet humans often consume bitter tasting plants. Dr. Timothy Johns has noted that although these plants contain markers that should cue humans to the presence of these toxins, humans continue to choose to eat bitter tasting plants, and that this is likely because there is a good reason for this, and that could be that there are health benefits from the consumption of bitter plants. Etkin and Ross noted that there's a large number of plants that are used both as food and medicinally among the Hausa in Nigeria, and that many of these plants are bitter. African food culture and dietary preferences are perhaps unique because while bitter foods are used in other parts of the world, bitter taste is often symbolic of something negative or a difficult experience, whereas there are many cultures or ethnic groups in Africa that have a strong preference for both bitter taste and slimy texture in traditional vegetables. This is very much true in East Africa, and this strong preference for bitter taste and slimy texture are exceptional examples of where human beings express a preference for something that we would expect them to have an innate aversion to. In this research project, we wanted to understand how these cultural preferences for slimy texture and bitter tasting vegetables evolved. We wanted to try and understand if there were patterns in these preferences, if certain linguistic or ethnic groups expressed these preferences more strongly, and if there was a geographical explanation or pattern for these preferences for slimy texture and bitter tasting traditional vegetables. We used the dPlace dataset, which includes data for 73 language or cultural groups across East Africa, across Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And we conducted a literature review. For each of those 73 ethnic groups, plus 3 others, the Luya, the Datoga, and the Pokot, we searched the literature using a systematic protocol to try and identify any literature that noted a preference in that ethnic group for slimy or bitter traditional vegetables. We also searched specifically for a range of traditional vegetables that are known to have a slimy texture and traditional vegetables that are known to have a bitter taste. So here is just an excerpt of the protocol, the systematic protocol we used. And for each ethnic group, we recorded if in the literature there was any evidence of a preference for slimy or bitter, as well as if there was any evidence of consumption of any of those slimy and bitter vegetable species listed on the previous slide. Here is an example of the data table that we compiled, showing some of the quotes that we pulled out of the literature to support the consumption of slimy species amongst these 2 ethnic groups. We also conducted a quantitative analysis once we had completed our data tables. We looked at dependent variables of bitter and slimy consumption, as well as bitter and slimy number of species consumed, yes, no, and bitter and slimy preference. We used independent variables, including whether or not there was a pattern amongst similar language groups, which livelihood practices were used by that ethnic group, and spatial variables, including whether or not malaria was prevalent in the region in which that ethnic group lives traditionally, and the percent of neighbors who consumed, who were listed in the literature as consuming bitter or slimy vegetables, and GPS location of latitude and longitude. We found that preference for slimy vegetables was expressed only in a few ethnic groups in the literature, of course, noting that absence from the literature does not mean absence of preference. And we found 23 ethnic groups who we were able to confirm did consume at least a couple of the slimy vegetables that we had identified in our methods section. Similarly, for bitter vegetables, we found only a handful of ethnic groups that we were able to confirm from the literature had a strong preference for bitter vegetables, and that we were also able to confirm 18 ethnic groups that did consume bitter vegetables. There is some plausible adaptive contribution for the consumption of slimy vegetables for groups that are transitioning from a diet that is traditionally based on animal source food, milk, and blood and meat, to a diet that is higher in grains and carbohydrates, in that the consumption of these slimy vegetables might help protect from chronic diseases such as diabetes and support healthy microbiome in the face of dietary change. For bitter vegetables, we saw some overlap with the same ethnic groups that preferred slimy vegetables, but the overlap was not consistent. We did see a strong pattern in that the ethnic groups that expressed a strong preference for bitter vegetables or consumed a large number of bitter vegetables tended to live in low-lying and coastal areas. And many of these ethnic groups report a medicinal value for bitter vegetables, and some even suggest that these bitter vegetables are important because they protect against fever or malaria. Indeed, when we mapped the prevalence of malaria against the preference for bitter vegetables, or the consumption of bitter vegetables, we do see a relationship where communities that express a preference or consume a large number of bitter vegetables live in areas with a higher prevalence of malaria. And in our regression model for whether or not an ethnic group was consuming bitter vegetables or was listed in the literature as having consumed bitter vegetables, we do see that the strongest predictors for this include the prevalence of malaria and whether or not other ethnic groups in that language group also consume bitter vegetables. So there is an association with ethnic group or language group and malaria prevalence and the consumption of bitter vegetables. Conversely, our regression model for whether or not an ethnic group was found in the literature to have consumed slimy vegetables showed that the strongest predictor for whether or not an ethnic group consumed slimy vegetables was whether or not their neighbors were consuming slimy vegetables. However, when we looked at the number of slimy vegetables consumed by a given ethnic group, we did then see an association with language group, meaning that those that spoke a Nilotic language were much more likely to consume a greater number of slimy vegetables. But also there still is this relationship with the neighboring ethnic group. So if the neighboring ethnic group consumes a large number of slimy vegetables, then the ethnic group in question is more likely to consume a larger number of slimy vegetables. So this research suggests that rather than being strange, unhealthy, or nonsensical practices, the practice of consuming slimy and bitter traditional vegetables among East African ethnic groups may in fact be an ecological adaptation. The consumption of these traditional vegetables may in fact help different ethnic groups adapt to their local environment, including environments with higher prevalence of malaria, or to a particular diet, or the intersection between a particular diet and a particular genetic makeup of an ethnic group. We don't know for sure whether or not these vegetables do play a role in health outcomes, but it certainly counters the idea that local people don't have necessarily sophisticated knowledge about health and the health impacts of the traditional vegetables that they choose to consume. This research also suggests that perhaps there may be unforeseen health implications to the stopping of consumption of these traditional vegetables, and it certainly provides impetus for efforts to increase and maintain the consumption of these culturally important traditional African vegetables. Thank you.